Yes, 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 please do. Okay, got a notification that says I'm recording the call.
Got it.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And this is another one of our All Things Black History Month special, our Make Me Wanna Holler special. The All Things Black Diaspora, and of course, wait, hold up, I'm messing up on my notes. Yes, and another yes, and All Things Canada special because we have L here. So, and yes, and we are joined by two of my favorites, two of my fondest returning champions and heroines and sheroes. Back on the program, we have Berneta L. Haynes, a consumer protection attorney, independent sci-fi fantasy fiction writer, and of course, outspoken leftist and abolitionist. And we are also joined once again by the stupendous L. Jones, poet, racial social justice activist, journalist with The Breach, and Halifax Examiner, co-host of Black Power Hour at CKDU FM in Nova Scotia, and she's also a university professor of political and Canadian studies. Did I get that right, Elle?
Yeah.
Perfect. At Mount St. Vincent University, and of course, we're going to be returning to our theme about abolitionism, police abolitionism, and whatnot. So, ladies, first off, thank you so much for coming back on the program, especially on Black History Month.
Well, thanks for having me back.
And sorry, the delays are mostly on my end. We were supposed to do this like in December and in January. And finally here.
Oh, no problem. No worries. If I have learned anything, patience is always a virtue, because there have been some guests that took me over a year to actually get them on the program, and when they did finally come on the program, it was well worth the waits and so forth. And just like your comrade Desmond Jones, Desmond Cole, who I had on this week. So. Anywho, but all right, let's get into the topic at hand. So we'll do this. I'll ask the question. Berneta, you'll be the first one to answer, and then Al, you can chime in. So when we talk about police abolitionism, I'm curious if both of you have studied the case of the Jefferey Dahmer case and the John Wayne Gacy cases. Both of these were very sadistic murderers, and that's often used as the very easy argument why we can't have police abolitionism, why the police are a necessary evil because of the vicious murderers, the Night Stalker, the Charles Mansons, or some kind of Jason Voorhees type of character, but at the same time, if you actually study both of these cases, I think you'll find that it actually does vindicate the case for abolishing the police. So, but are you both familiar with both the Jefferey Dahmer case and the John Wayne Gacy case?
I'm more familiar with the Dahmer case, and it absolutely does uplift the argument that police abolition is necessary and that we're not necessarily better off with police. We have a situation with the Dahmer case where police were notified multiple times and refused to act.
Actually, okay, before we talk about incompetence and whatnot, do explain to people who are not familiar with the Jeffrey Dahmer case, what was the Jeffrey Dahmer case?
So the Jeffrey Dahmer case happened in Milwaukee. It was a queer white man who essentially targeted queer men of color primarily, many of them young boys, many of them teenagers, with very sadistic murders. Very recently, Evan Peters portrayed him in the Netflix special, which I refused to watch on principle because the families did not support that special being made. I believe, I'm not exactly sure how many victims he had total, but at any rate, a neighbor was very aware to some extent of some suspicious activity happening, and she reported to the police several times, and they did not act. At one point, one of the victims ran away, managed to get away, one of the teenage boys. and turned up at the police station unclothed. And the police essentially called Dahmer and had Dahmer pick him up. And that boy ended up being another victim.
Whoa, wait. Hold on for a second. So Dahmer preyed on his victims. So preyed on his victims and then sadistically tortured them, raped them, you name it. But the one that got away went to the police. They didn't believe him, and ergo they called Jeffrey Dahmer as if he was like their guardian or boyfriend. And
at some point, at least, Jeffrey Dahmer showed up at the police station and he was released into Jeffrey Dahmer's custody, is what I do know. And this boy showed up with like head injuries, from what I recall reading. And then he was also unclothed, so he wasn't fully clothed at all, and was basically telling the police, help me, help me, help me. And once Jeffrey Dahmer was at the police station, they released the boy to him. That's what I do know.
And what was their rationale? Did they think that this was just some
lovers quarrel? Process? They assumed it was some sort of lovers quarrel.
You've got to be kidding me.
Nope. I wish I remembered that particular young man's name.
But even if the police had that assumption, why would you release a supposedly battered spouse and whatnot back to the person who's making the j'accuse accusation?
Homophobia is pretty much the answer. And the fact that this young man wasn't white, so his life wasn't even viewed as valuable in the same way that he would have been viewed potentially if he was white. But homophobia is the real answer to that.
Wow, unbelievable! And Miss Jones, were you familiar with either the Dahmer case or John Wayne Gacy, who was this he was this guy who did like handy work and stuff like that. He was also like a Democratic Party, like local, activist of sorts, and he kidnapped lots of boys, underage boys, teenage boys, even men around, his age, and just brutally like sexually assaulted them, brutally murdered them, kept all of their like remains either in his own house or just, I don't know, like cut up the bodies and whatnot and like threw them in rivers and stuff like that. And before I make the case how it actually helps your arguments of police abolition, I just want to know, like, are you familiar with that case? Either of you familiar with that with John Wayne Gacy?
I'm familiar with the outlines. I don't study like serial killer cases. I obviously don't find it something that I'm not fascinated with the details or anything like that. But in what Berneta was saying, that's very similar to a case in Canada of Robert Pickton, who...
I was going to ask about that. Yes, explain the Robert Pickton case.
Robert Pickton was a serial killer in Canada who killed dozens of women. It's like over 50. He was abducting women from the east side of Vancouver, many of whom, but not all, and that's one of the stereotypes, but many of whom were sex workers. Some of them were not. Many of whom were Indigenous. And the outlines are much like Berneta said. Very early on, one of the women actually escaped. She had a handcuff. She broke through and she had a handcuff key that fit the other half of the handcuffs. And the police, while she was in the hospital, so she had the evidence on her and they refused to believe her. And he went on to kill multiple more women. In one of the grotesque details, he had a pig farm and he was grinding the women up and feeding them to the pigs. But he also held parties on his property that many police people and crowns and stuff went to. So he would throw these big parties with sex workers and, a lot of the people went. And so these women weren't valued when their family members went. It was like, oh, she must just be on a drug binge. She probably just ran away. And again, many of them were Indigenous women. So very similar outlines where they were not valued by the police. And quite interestingly as well, the person who was the communications person at the time for the RCMP ended up joining with the families when they sued the RCMP for negligence, because she said that, while the case was going on, so she was a female officer and she was doing, the PR stuff. While the case was going on, instead of investigating the case, they were busy sexually harassing her. They were watching porn at work. They were making sexual jokes about the woman. In fact, so she ended up siding with the families and testifying for the families. She ended up quitting the RCMP. She has massive PTSD and trauma, like agoraphobia. Like she can't go outside because she was like viciously sexually harassed by the RCMP, who have the largest class action lawsuit in Canada for sexual harassment, not only for their members, but also the civilian members. And then her son ended up growing up and being involved in a drug murder, and he's now serving life. And she said she blames the RCMP because, and his father was also an RCMP officer, and he stayed with the RCMP. So she divorced him. And after all this, he stayed with the RCMP and ended up being the communications person they brought in when the mass shooter in Nova Scotia in Portapique killed multiple people in the worst mass shooting we've ever had in this province. And of course, that mass shooter, Gabriel Wortman, was driving around in a police car that he had made, a mock police car that he had in his barn. And was literally driving around in a police car and shot people from this car. And of course, there's a big inquiry that just happened in Nova Scotia about it because the RCMP didn't alert the public in a timely manner that this man was in a police car. There was multiple reports before he did the shooting. He had violence. So they said, oh, no, he wasn't known to the police. And it turned out multiple people had reported violence. He had committed an assault. He was, of course, domestically abusing his wife, and many of these people also have domestic abuse, and everybody knew about this and didn't do anything. So you see the very same outlines in these cases where there's information early on that could have saved lives. You know, there's no reason for these things not to be investigated, and because it's just a woman or just a sex worker, an Indigenous person or a person of color, nothing's investigated. The people often have insinuated themselves with the police and are well known as friends, donate to the police, you know, do all of these, like these are very, very common patterns that you see in these cases, and they illustrate so much of the corruption and inability of the police. So exactly, obviously where Berneta's going as well is like, these are things that we say, okay, at least we need the police for that. Like, we don't need them to hand out fines for people.
Exactly.
But we need them for major crimes, but they don't do that either. They can't stop mass shooters. They can't stop serial killers.
Yeah,
so
they prevent crime.
You know, like
that's absolutely it. They don't prevent crime. You're probably hard pressed to find a woman who says police prevented her from being raped, for instance. Let me make sure that it's very clear, though, in the Dahmer case, because I don't want to misspeak on the details.
Okay.
That young man, I should say young boy, was like only 14 years old. And he was essentially roaming the streets, unclothed, naked, with like bruises. I think he'd been like bruised in the head. And neighbors actually reported him wandering in a dazed fashion. So police showed up. So he didn't make it to the police station. Police showed up. When police showed up, they questioned the boy, but apparently Dahmer got to the scene as well. And Dahmer convinced him that this boy was his, lover, and he was drunk. Neighbors, Black folks who were on the scene, tried to discourage the police from releasing the boy to Dahmer. They protested. It didn't matter. The police released him back to Dahmer. And he was later victim of murder, rape, dismemberment, you name it.
Jesus Christ. But it's interesting because
one of at least 17 or 18 men. So
it's interesting because when I was watching this because when I was watching this Netflix documentary about John Wayne Gacy, and often when you watch a documentary about organized crime, or you watch a documentary about these vicious serial killers, which I myself am not very interested in, but I just thought, well, let me just watch this documentary. I'm preparing for this interview, so let me watch this. And I was very shocked because, again, like John Wayne Gacy, or somebody like Ramirez, the Night Stalker, but somebody like John Wayne Gacy, they're used as the easy argument. This is why we need to have the police. The police are a necessary evil. But just like what you said about Jeffrey Dahmer, the institutional heteronormativity, the queer phobia, Gacy, a lot of the people he murdered, they were of a queer background. They were gay men, but because of that, the police did not want to investigate it. And and even those who were just teenagers who had gone missing, when the family actually went to the police and say, my child is missing, he hasn't come back home. They actually did not even like investigate the kid's missing. They made all sorts of stupid excuses like, well, you know, it hasn't been 24 hours yet, and so forth. Or, oh, I'm sure he's just like getting drunk with his friends. I'm sure he'll turn up eventually. Like, they only caught John Wayne Gacy because there was like, well, this guy has done a sexual assaults before, or he was put on like a sex offenders list. And it was only when like they actually like, you know, took the guy in for questioning, like Gacy, being like the narcissistic like dumbass he was, as most sociopaths are, like they have like very high self-esteem. He actually just like wound up like confessing to like most of like his like, you know, like killers and stuff like that. And it was only that was how like the police like, you know, found, okay, we over like 25 like body parts and stuff like that, and then other people like in, you know, like, you know, in rivers and stuff like that. So here I am watching this documentary thinking, well, it's this documentary that's going to be like that's again going to be like the arguments I have about why we need the police as necessary evil. No, like actually that, and what you've talked about with Jefferey Dahmer, and what L you've talked about with Robert Pickton, actually, ironically, no, it's the other way around. Like, no, the police, like the police utterly failed, not only in like preventing more murders from happening, but they didn't even do basic police 101 supposedly, which is trying to find a missing child or keeping somebody who's saying this person's abusing me from harm and so forth. Your responses to all of what I just said.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think you can talk to the average sexual assault survivor and you will find all the argument you need for why police aren't necessary, that they're useless. I think abolition is about recognizing these sort of systemic historical inequities that are embedded in every institution and in our countries, and particularly in the institution of policing and prisons. It demands that we acknowledge in U.S. history that, you know, Black people have been disproportionately subjected to this kind of state-sponsored punishment by design, and that no matter the generations of mobilizing against a state complicit in enslaving, lynching, and leasing, and just punishing and incarcerating Black people, new
Indigenous people and Latinx people and immigrants, illegal or otherwise.
Yeah, new incarnations of punishment and surveillance, they constantly emerge, no matter all our attempts at reform. So abolition really demands that we think differently about, you know, how to end this pattern of practice.
Let's see, but then I'm wondering, and Berneta answer this, and Elle, you can jump in on this, which is okay. So all that being said, then how would society deal with the Robert Picktons, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmers of the world without, without police? And would this proposition, because if you're somebody like me who advocates for community control over the police, in which, okay, police, you're no longer going to throw somebody in jail and for a traffic violation and murder that Aboriginal person in custody, which was what happened in Australia with a notorious case of Miss Jalika Dill. So the police aren't going to be like harassing people for a broken tail light, harassing people for being homeless, harassing people because they're late in paying their rents or their mortgages, or whatever is the stupid reason that they use to murder our people and our indigenous people and our queer people with impunity. What then do we do when we actually do have a Robert Pickton, a John Wayne Gacy, or Jeffrey Dahmer, or, well, you said as you started watching Changeling, or a murderer like that?
I believe it was New York Times that did a study back in 2020, I think it was, where they found that only about 4% of policing actually involves these violent crimes. Most police work is mundane work, ticketing people, patrolling schools, hospitals, public transit. So I think focusing so much on the 4% or less of extremely violent types and violent crimes is just an easy way to sort of distract from the core conversation, which is that they're not necessary. Much of what they do can be done by other members of society and much more efficiently and with much more humanity.
Ms. Jones, your response to that?
Yeah, I don't think that abolition means that therefore we all believe that the Paul Bernardos of the world should be running the streets. Like, obviously, those people need to be away from people for their own safety. Does that have to, and for our safety, obviously, and also, like, does that have to look like a prison? Does that, there are many ways to separate somebody and keep them away from us that doesn't have to look like the institution that we have now. So we also have to, for example, examine what it is in us that wants to see the picture of Paul Bernardo's cell that's 6 foot with the toilet right there. And that isn't anything to do with empathy for Paul Bernardo, or whatever serial killer. There's nothing to do with feeling bad for them, or, that's not my point. But my point is that will to punishment and the need for us, and this is, of course, Foucault's point, right? Like when he said it was more honest when we just kind of took people into the town square and tortured them and, burn them to death and strip them, and then everybody watched it, and you had to take accountability for that. Like, you were going to go down, and this person was going to be punished, and you were going to watch it, and you were going to participate in it. So you knew it was happening. And this is exactly Foucault's point about what happens in modernity, is we bury that into the prison and then go, oh, we're so reformed, we're so progressive, we're so civilized. We don't burn people at the stake, we don't cut their hands off, we don't rend their flesh, but we want them in a cell at 24 hours in solitary confinement. We want them, all of that. So that's exactly the point Foucault made about, what is happening that we don't want to be accountable for it. Just like we want to have drones that we don't have to be accountable for, right? We don't actually have to kill the people. We can just press the button and, oh, well, some people died. It was collateral damage. So there's a constant removal of violence and then a removal of our own involvement, accountability. But at the same time, this vicious will that people have to see people punished and tortured out of vindictiveness. And we don't want to examine that and understand that that's very primitive. And I'm not talking about the victims here, like people who have victimized me, like I have wanted them dead, like I'm not suggesting here, like, all victims just need to forgive people. When people harm you, like it's real, right? Like you are angry, you see that person around and you just can't stand it. You want, like.
But that said, though,
prison doesn't give that closure. Actually, prison doesn't give you that healing. Prison doesn't provide you the things you actually need, which is to have your pain acknowledged by people, which is to get the healing that you need. So this isn't about, disavowing victims or saying that victims don't have pain or anger or that they need to forgive or anything like that. It's about saying that, this system that we invest billions and trillions of dollars in doesn't bring us the things we want. It doesn't actually effectively punish in the way that we want. It doesn't prevent crime. It doesn't create rehabilitation. It doesn't help victims and support them. And in fact, anyone who's being victimized knows you get a very small window where people are sympathetic, and then it's like, get over it, move on. Why are you still going on about?
But that said, sorry, but that said, and I'm glad that you brought that up, though. But isn't police abolitionism? Isn't that us getting to that? For lack of a better word, isn't that us getting to that kind of Christianity where we forgive the people who commit sins, we forgive the people who have viciously wronged, and so forth like that? Isn't that just like another way of us saying of us saying to the victim to get over it? Time will heal all wounds.
No, I don't think it's a moral project at all. I don't think it has anything to do with a kind of Christian sin-based morality. If we look at transformative justice, for example, where people recognize that, so people often, the other example people always use is, what about rapists? You want rapists running the streets? Like, rapists are running the streets right now, and many of them are wearing uniforms and they're cops, Many of them are prosecutors, many of them are politicians.
The military was just the police on steroids.
The rapists in the White House, so, they're running the streets now. Only 1% of rapes end in any kind of conviction. And in fact, rapists get very little time versus like black kids with a gram of marijuana or whatever, So, but when you have a transformative justice circle, it's not saying forgive the person, it's actually making that person accountable to you. It's actually supposed to be a process where the person is accountable to community, where rather than doing 6 months and everybody being like, he didn't even do anything, why are you being like this, that actually we would want the community to recognize a harm happened here and to actually support the person that was harmed and say, what do you need? And actually support that person in having that and hold the person who did that harm accountable, and not just for 6 months or 2 years until people feel that as a community, like this has taken place. So it's not about dismissing harm at all. In fact, it's more dismissive of harm to think that a sentence somehow takes care of it. Here's this like punishment, the person was punished and now it's over. They walk free, but they still have to be in the community. They still work alongside you. They still do all of those things, right? So aren't we going to have to learn to deal with harm anyway? Even with prisons, harm persists. So the point is, we don't know how to deal with harm. We don't know how to get rapists out of our friend circles. So no, I don't think we're prepared for abolition yet, like in terms of like if aliens came down and like zapped up the prison, but that's because we're not being taught. We're not being taught how to deal with conflict. We're not learning how to be accountable.
It goes back to what your comrade who I spoke to the other day, Desmond, says, in which he was saying that abolitionism is not about like, we have all of the answers, kind of like how Marxist-Leninist sort of approach, Communist Manifesto, and that's kind of like, we have all the answers, it's in this goddamn book, and it's in Mao Zedong's book. What you're saying is sort of what Desmond was saying, which is abolitionism is a process. I'm learning every day. Yeah. How are we going to, I'm learning these days, how are we going to radically reinvent the wheel when it comes to punishment, when it comes to those who have been harmed, when it comes to legitimate grievances. It's just not this punitive this punitive system, which in the end of the day really masks classism, heteronormativity, racism, and so forth, because that's, in the end of the day, that is what the police are there to function, persecute poor people of all colors, but to really go after indigenous people, black people, the occasional trans prostitute, and so forth, and rack them and stack them, right? So,
and I just want to add to that on a couple of notes here. In terms of reinventing the wheel, it's very important to recognize that the modern prison system is a relatively new phenomenon. And so we're not necessarily reinventing the wheel. It means we have to look further back than we currently do to see what's been done before and what can potentially be applied now, outside of Eurocentric cultures, outside of our contemporary culture. I also want to point out something you said earlier about, is it putting the survivors' needs kind of at the mercy of the victimizer and requiring them to forgive? Restorative justice is literally quite the opposite. It focuses on the relationship between the offender and the victim and centers the survivor's needs in a way that our current traditional court system doesn't. So the questions become not what law was broken, who broke it, and how do we punish them, but rather who was harmed, what does he or she who was harmed actually need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So the questions shift. It doesn't matter necessarily that it doesn't mean necessarily that the victim is going to be forced or in some way compelled to forgive their victimizer. It just means that now their needs are actually at the center instead of the court system's need to punish.
But what about some of those victims that actually do believe in the death sentence, or actually do want to see the person who did the person who did murder their family, or the person who actually brutalized them and then raped them? What about some of those victims that actually do want to see the grotesque punitive punishment and like the death penalty and so forth? And before you answer that, it's funny because I was thinking about the Roman Polanski case. Now, he did do the sexual assault on the underage person, but that same underage person says, I don't want him to go to jail. Look, I've forgiven the guy. Stop trying to like witch hunt for him and put him in jail so I can live through all this thing. I've forgiven him. I've moved on from Roman Polanski. Let him do it. So yeah, both of your responses to both of those
Well,
both of those things.
I mean, there's an immense, and this is what I mean about sort of the gendered pressure. There's an immense amount of coercion around victims right now, actually. If you've ever been victimized by somebody, people have zero sympathy past like, like there'll be like the day where people are like, oh, that's so sad. And then you're supposed to get over it. You're not like, so for example, at Dalhousie, where they had so in 2015, there was a case at Dalhousie University I used to go to of the Dal dentistry. And it turned out that these dentistry students had throughout their time in Dalhousie, and they were caught in their 4th year by a whistleblower, or having a secret Facebook group where all the men were, and they had like pictures of their female classmates and in like bikinis, and they would talk about their bodies and call them sluts and make rape jokes, and there was all this racist content. It was actually quite covered up, but they also took pictures of patients in the clinics and would talk about like that fat whale on the stretcher and stuff like that. They talked about chloroforming and raping their patients. And in fact, one of the men actually ended up whistleblowing because I think he like ended up with a girlfriend and then like felt guilty and showed it to her. And they coerced the woman into restorative justice. So 4 of the women said they didn't want restorative justice, and they thought that the men should be expelled and weren't appropriate to be dentists. And they were completely shut down by the university. And this restorative justice process was used with a woman. And of course, this is like, so now you're responsible. Now it's like, hey, do you want this man that you've gone to school with for 4 years? Do you want to ruin his life? And then like, that's the pressure that's put on you. So what choice did those women have other than to engage in this process? That wasn't a true restorative justice process. It was like, used by this neoliberal institution who had invested, hundreds of thousands of dollars in these dentists whose names they kept anonymous. And then the only name that was published was the name of the whistleblower. And so my point is that, and now ask me if they've ever used restorative justice since. Ask me if they've used restorative justice for all the Black people they've kicked out of the university. No. When I went to that university after I graduated from a different university and told them that I was abused at that university, they had to fight to even get a meeting. I cried through that meeting. And at the end of it, they sent me the same email they sent me at the very beginning. Sorry that you had this experience. Here's all the diversity committees that we have now. They didn't hear a word I said. So just to say that this is exactly the neoliberal discourse. This isn't abolition, right? That women in particular, and especially when you're dealing with power, someone like Roman Polanski, a male dentistry student, are compelled not into a true accounting of harm, but to like knuckle under and go through this process. You don't want to ruin his life. And then you have to look his sister in the face who you live in the community with, or his girlfriend that's friends with you. And she's gonna be like, what a fucking bitch. Like, why can't you just, he's sorry, it wasn't even that big a deal. Like, that is actually what happens. That is actually what happens when you challenge power. I have challenged power and experienced from my own community the most violence, the most shaming, the most everything. And that happens now when we don't have any abolition. So like when what we're talking about is actually, what if you actually said, okay, I know that I understand you feel this anger. Let's talk about this. Let's work this through. I want to kill people that have harmed me. That's normal. That is actually human. But also, you're going to have to move from that place, and people are going to have not to forgive, but for yourself, right? So it's not a moral question of like religious sin or morality and forgiveness. It's actually about engaging with someone who has been victimized and walking with them through a very long journey of healing. And then I'll also say that, sure, I mean, we don't let people go out and hunt down people who harm them, though, right? Like, which is what people want to do. And like, if somebody killed my family, I'd want to hunt them down and murder them, but I'm not allowed to do that. I'm supposed to defer this into the justice system, right? Where I don't even get my own lawyer, right? Like, if you're victimized, you don't get standing in the system. Like, if somebody shoots my brother, like the police, I have no standing. It's not about me. It's about, the Crown versus, I'm not even involved. I'm not even part of this system. So does this sound healthy? Does this sound like closure?
So is that why Samantha Geimar, even when she says, look, I've forgiven Roman Polanski, you don't have to hunt for him, why the I guess Hollywood, so it's Los Angeles Police Department, is that why the LTP is still having such a hard-on for Polanski then?
Well, I haven't talked to her. I don't know what she feels. But I think people's issue with it is that it's not that there was actually a process where he was accountable to her. He ran away, and I'm not even like, but I think what people have the issue with that is he continued to be celebrated by Hollywood. He continued to make movies. He continued, like, nothing other than he can't go to the States. And he was never accountable. He's never actually sat down with her, right, and said, and thought about what that means. He hasn't processed the harm. In fact, he has framed himself as a victim. And I think that's the issue that people have. How many women's lives and careers have been ruined because we didn't smile at the right person? Yet men can rape you and continue on and win Oscars. I think that is the issue people have. And that is, of course, she's at the center. She's the victim, but it's also broader than her. It's about the system that allows powerful men to be in the White House after they grab women's pussies, that allow them to be on the Supreme Court after they rape women in college, that allows men. So even if their victims forgive them, we still need to have a conversation about why that happens. And so, yes, they should be centered in that conversation. But if a victim says, you know, I just don't, because there's lots of reasons. I don't want to deal with this anymore. It's been too long. I don't want my life to be about this. I don't want people to know me.
That's what she's expressed versions of that.
Yeah. So I can't speak for her, and I would never. It's disgusting to speak for somebody else. But I'm saying that the reason why people still critique it is because many people have noticed the difference between, like, the many Black people that are being pushed out of Hollywood for various reasons versus Polanski. So white men can rape, you know, sleep with their stepdaughters, rape 13-year-olds, you know, like Weinstein, you know, and like be massively successful and never called to account. And that is what people are saying, that you have never been accountable. And abolition is actually about accountability. It's actually about that. And I know people in prison who have gone through restorative justice, and they all say it's the hardest thing you'll ever do. It's much harder than sitting in a cell, to sit across from the person that you harmed and have them look in your face and tell you all the ways that you harmed them. And you don't get to wiggle out of it. You don't get to say, but. You have to listen to that. And when you understand that harm and have to be accountable, they all say that it's like nothing is harder in your life. But it's also very freeing when it's done. Because when you're able to take that accountability, then it actually does allow you to, you know, like, change things and move forward and transform and become something different, which is what we ultimately want. Like, we want people who have committed harm to be able to do differently and think differently and be differently and do better and make accountability and reparation. But it's not easy. It's not an easy option at all. It's much easier to sit in your cell, get out, go on. I'm not saying prison's easy, but it's a lot harder to look that person in the face while they tell you, this is what you did to me. And you have to say, yeah, I did. And live with that and feel that shame.
Before I get to this next question, Berneta, anything else you want to add or expand on what Elle said?
No, Elle is completely nailing it. I just think that it's really about balancing the individual with the collective in a large part. Yes, putting the victim's needs at the center, but not necessarily just, you know, yielding to, you know, the victim's every impulse just because they're the victim. That doesn't actually put into consideration the importance of, you know, improving the community and keeping the community safe and improving our mindsets about criminality and violence and so forth. It goes back to what Elle was saying about some of the folks who are on the inside who go through the restorative justice model. That is such a profound kind of transformation that people experience. And abolition and restorative justice should be about transforming not only the victim and trying to make them whole, but also transforming the community in the process, as well as the perpetrator, the victimizer as well. So there's a lot of a balancing act that has to happen here. It's not one way or the other.
Miss Jones, you said that when that this whole idea of abolitionism and the justice that both you and Berneta are articulating, which you guys don't call it restorative justice, you guys call it transformative justice.
Well, they're related.
Okay. But that's like okay, but because you said it was Black women that came up with that, and did that come from the epidemic of gang violence that happened throughout the 80s and 90s with the drug wars and the Crips and the Bloods and so forth, and drive-by shootings that gangs would do? Like, is that where that kind of social racial justice of, yes, these people did a lot of harm, yes, it's disgusting that they killed so and so for whatever, or killed or robbed this convenience store for whatever, but the reason why all of our people are doing this is because of poverty, institutional racism, divide and conquer of which is colonialism, white supremacy, and so forth. Ergo, we need a completely different way of of approaching the harm that we do, which isn't just locking them up, mass incarceration, and all of the Dickensian stuff of the Clinton crime bill and so forth.
I want to say that's not true, but it was more Black women who had experienced sexual violence. So who had experienced sexual violence in their homes as children from their family members, women who experienced it from their partners, and who recognized that this white supremacist system was never going to heal them, hold accountable, keep them safe. And, women that, like, as we know, you go to the police, they don't do anything. Like, you go to authorities, nothing happens. So recognizing that we are going to have to keep each other safe. So it was really women who have deeply experienced harm and know what that is, who recognize that the system isn't going to bring them safety or healing or transformation, and trying to figure out other ways of doing it. So that's restorative justice is really indigenous. So they're related, but so restorative justice, at least in Canada, is from indigenous traditions. And that's, again, like community circles. So in like indigenous communities, based on a lot of historical practices that indigenous people had around addressing harm. So like making reparation, often going out onto the land, like community circles. So both of them are community based, but slightly different histories and perhaps slightly different approaches, but based in the same ideas.
Yeah, which is why I constantly emphasize that we just have to look back a little further and recognize that our current prison system is a modern phenomenon, that there are practices that predated it that were effective and much more holistic and humane. As Elle mentioned, restorative justice came out of that among the indigenous groups on this continent.
But then sorry to again repeat this question. But then, so say that system is in place, or even say, what I advocate, community control over the police is in place, in which, again, all of those Neo-Dickensian laws, the Clinton crime bill, all that stuff is put into the dustbin, and the police are only given whatever tools they need to solve murder or to go after the Jefferey Dahmers of the world, the Charles Mansons of the world, and so forth like that. So say we have that, but then how would but then when a murder does happen, and if it is like caught, how would we deal with somebody who has absolutely like no remorse for the crimes they committed, a Jeffrey, some kind of the Hannibal Lecters or whatever disgusting people that like come out of like movies and shit like that, or even real life folk.
Well, I will just re-emphasize that only about 4% max of policing really deals with those kinds of violent criminals and violent crimes.
But if the police only did that, not the harassing homeless people, the traffic violations, and and the state terrorism that they do.
Mm-hmm. And what are you saying the police would bring to that? Because they're not necessarily going to prevent those things. Police are reactive. So after the fact. So what are you saying that their utility is?
I guess I'm saying that there are still going to be murders that take place, and there are still going to be gruesome, crimes that take place. So the police would still be a necessary evil, but the police wouldn't be the institutional evil that they are, which is terrorizing our communities, terrorizing indigenous people, terrorizing the poor and the dispossessed and whatnot.
I think accepting any necessary evil is already setting yourself up for disaster. I think that abolition of police, abolition of prisons is really about recognizing at the roots, how do we actually solve some of the sicknesses, you could say, some of the problems that are at the root of our culture that even contribute to the Dahmers, to some of this, small percentage of folks who do the most horrific crimes. As long as we have police there to just react when these people commit harms, we're never going to stop those harms from being committed. Abolition forces us to recognize that there is a way that we can actually get to the root of these problems and maybe even prevent these kinds of murders and things from happening so frequently. But I just want to say too that when it comes to defunding and abolishing the police, like there are steps, right? And I would really suggest that folks take a look at forworldwithoutpolice.org. It's a really fantastic organization and website that kind of lays out strategies for.
Send me the link. I'll make sure to put it in the pinned comments section. Okay. I upload it on YouTube.
Yeah, but it's a sort of it's about disempowering police, disarming them, and then disbanding them. You can't just all of a sudden, I mean, you can, but I don't know what it would look like, what that world would look like if you just all of a sudden disband them. But there are steps that you have to take. So first, learning how to rely on each other more so than the police. That requires a lot of communication being developed, opportunities for communities to, self-educate and learn some, collective conflict resolution skills for different types of situations. It can allow people to begin to exclude police from our lives more, right? We can mediate our own conflicts, but it does take community building. It does take communication. And then building organizations that actually deal with police violence, like fighting police violence. So that's, looking at how to monitor police conduct and challenge their legitimacy in our communities. And, thirdly, in the whole disempowerment phase, developing zones where, we have cop-free zones, right? To some extent. That really does require reclaiming certain public spaces to, sort of air grievances and socialize and challenge all the ways that, capitalism fragments us. And that's just the disempowerment phase of abolishing police, right? Then there's the whole disarming them. The kind of weaponry that police have, at least in the United States, is intense. Most of it directly from our military. So recognizing that there are ways that we have to close the pipeline between the military and the police. That includes shutting down programs that sell military equipment to the police departments.
I would say abolish the goddamn military and abolish the CIA.
And again, that even requires
and say and GCHQ and CSIS and their Australian Kiwi counterparts, defund all of that, abolish all of them, put that right into the gutter and flush it down. I don't ever want to see a U.S. military and its counterparts and ever.
Well, yeah, I mean, defunding the military it should be a big part of actually, how we ultimately can disband police and abolish police. But, absolutely. But we do have to figure out ways to shut down those programs that sell military weapons to police, that train military personnel to become officers, that find veterans for the police force. We have to be able to expose and denounce political repression that includes using informants to infiltrate movements and activist movements and so forth.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different ways that we have to approach disarming before we ever get to disbanding police. So I really think it's very important that when we talk about abolition, that we kind of lay it out to some extent that we emphasize that it's a process and that it's not an all at once kind of thing that's going to happen. Because even once we get to disbanding, we have to really transform the way that we think about crime and how to handle conflict and identity. We have to focus on particular police units for disbanding. This has to be kind of localized, decommissioning precincts and all of that, and not to mention demolishing the power of police unions. So there's a process to this, as Errol has indicated, and I think we have to emphasize when we talk about abolishing the police that it is a process. It's not reform or anything like that. It is literally a process of getting rid of police as a presence in our lives, period.
So yeah, go ahead.
Just going to add that it's interesting, and I know that you're sort of posing these questions, but it's interesting that people can name 2 serial killers, 10 serial killers, and that's supposed to destroy the abolition project, but police thousands of people a year, and we still maintain the police, So it's always interesting that if one person kills somebody, then an abolitionist says, oh, ha, ha, now you've been proven wrong. But how many like 1 in 3 women or something in prison have been sexually assaulted and harassed by a guard, or 1 in 2. You know, so prison rape is extremely high, but we don't abolish prisons because a guard raped a woman. You know, police are constantly killing people, beating people, being caught in corruption, raping people in their black sites. We don't, you know, like, we didn't disband the army once Abu Ghraib came to light, right? So, you know, like, we've had, the abolition, 1996 is when Abolition Convergence was officially, like, that conference. So there's been, 30 years where people have been talking about this. And if we don't have all the answers, you know, abolition must be a failed project. But these hundreds of years of colonial violence, like, why don't we disband Canada? You know, like, wasn't residential schools enough? You know, so it's interesting how power always gets infinite chances.
Oh, by the way, I just want to throw it out there. I am for disbanding Canada. I am for disbanding the United States and Australia and New Zealand. I'm a radical I'm for radical decolonization, but that's a whole other story for another day.
So, like, this is the idea, right? That it would be it's absurd to suggest that Canada's even racist. Never mind that we should disband it after the, you know. Yeah. Like ongoing violence and colonization for 500 years. But in 30 years of thinking through abolition, if a serial killer happens, that somehow proves that the whole thing is bunk, you know? So it just really shows how we default to this idea of the status quo. And there's no act of violence too obscene to make a prison or police or a military not exist. But these things are supposed to prove that abolition doesn't work.
Right.
But that
it's really important to emphasize, Youri, that just the burden of proof on abolitionists is just really obscene. You know, it's just, as Elle said, it's just really obscene. But I want to point out too that something else that Elle said, like in terms of the people who are in prison, many are there for minor offenses, minor infractions. As I think it was a study from 2021, make up like 80% of state criminal dockets. You need look no further than Rikers.
So that's sort of like the broken windows theory, even before broken windows even existed, because England, which that's modern day policing, started in England, and it had nothing to do with solving. Again, it had nothing even to do with solving murders. The Metropolitan Police Scotland Yard was there to basically eradicate Irish nationalism and Irish people resisting settler colonialism, which first started in Ireland, and of course have fun, eradicating Scottish and like Welsh nationalism and so forth like that. And the crimes that
I was just my dad's Welsh, that's why I was like Welsh nationalism.
yes, I remember that. Yeah. You're for Wales in the World Cup on Twitter.
And I'll say
basically, I think it goes back to what you guys have always been explaining to me, that the police were never, ever, ever, ever there to solve murders, rapists, Jack the Ripper style crimes. They were there to persecute the poor. And let's be honest, they were there to basically keep, Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, the browner you are, in line. But then when we do talk about, so both of you have said that abolitionism is a process. This isn't this like Karl Marx book or Mao's Red Book where like all the answers are in this one book, so just follow it, or whatever theories of like Trotsky. So if abolitionism is all about a process, is that where sort of community control of the police comes in? And then therefore, because I was going to ask you guys, what about the bank robbers? What about the con artists who con people out of their money? What about the scam artists? What about organized crime? In other words, those will still be dealt with, but since the roots of all of society's ills is this unjust system of capitalism, and since the CIA basically created like drug trafficking and stuff like that, and most organized crime would be over tomorrow if we ended the discredited prohibitionist drug war. So is that where if you say, fine, if you want the police to be a necessary evil, yes, we'll still need a police to deal with those ills, but the main goal is that we do want to get rid of this discredited institution, and it's going to go through a long process, just like even decolonization is a long process.
Do we think that people, are born and when you ask them what they want to be in like kindergarten, they're like, I want to be a scam artist? Like, obviously not, so capitalism doesn't provide people with opportunities, and then people commit crimes of poverty, crimes of opportunity, crimes of trauma, which is most of it. So, I mean, the idea that these crimes, like, the idea that it's like organic to people, so therefore we will always need prisons, because, like, how does that even, if that were true, if it were true that some percentage of the population is just, violent or just a scammer or just whatever, then what is the point of politics? What's the point of any of it, right? Like, the whole sort of project of democracy is supposed to assume that we all have the capacity to be, reasonable, responsible citizens, right? Like, that's why we're not just ruled. We are ruled by a cabal of elites, but, that's at least the performance. The same people that, want us to vote also want us to believe that some proportion of humanity is unsalvageable, rather than, and this is actually race science. So if you actually look at the way that race science and heredity feeds into politics, like, sorry to give a lecture, but, like, Kant comes along and Kant argues that the human capacity for reason is, like, this is what actually makes us human, as opposed to like God granting us things, but only white people have that capacity for reason. And then that becomes, in politics, the capacity to be a reasonable voting member, but only white property-owning men have that. And then, of course, you get heredity science that says that, Black people are just degraded, criminal by our genes. And then that becomes culture. So you have this trajectory where the same ideas that Black people are just outside of humanity in various ways, whether that's through reason, whether that's through our genes and biology, whether that's through our pathological culture, it's always being reworked. And that is what the prison idea is as well, that we are just somehow pathologically incapable of so-called behaving. So therefore, a prison is needed for us as some kind of like just bequeathed upon us because it's our inevitable heritage, as if these things aren't actually. So just like a 19th century anthropologist would have, or political scientist would have told you that it was our defective genes and not our environment that created a defective or whatever. Now it's somehow that, people just want, there's some pathological people, read Black people, that just want to be scammers and con artists and shoplifters, as if that isn't caused by social conditions, by the lack of resources in capitalism, by the lack of housing, the lack of food. When young children see their parents, when they're, your mother can't feed herself, and you're like, well, I'm 11, I can go out on these streets and I can help my mom if I sell these drugs, right? Like, do you think that child doesn't have dreams? That child isn't a criminal. Like, I know so many people that, started dealing when they were little because, yeah, they saw their mother crying.
But it sounds to me as if you've completely, just like, destroyed the right-wing argument, which is that there are some people who are just moral degenerates, and we need the police to hyper punish those people who commit crimes because look, look, I know poor people and they're not the ones committing crimes, but those people who do commit crimes, this is why we need to keep punishing them, throw them in jail over and over again. And it sounds to me as if like you very much push back against that argument that enemy Paul made, who became leader of the Green Party, who said that no amount saying that yes, I'm all for social justice, but no amount of socialism, but you're going to have murderers and rapers, ergo there's no amount of socialism that's going to cure some people, ergo the police are necessary evil. That was basically her arguments.
And how does she? I mean, yeah. And I do have to go soon because I have to go to radio, but. How do people imagine that we would contain the police to just investigating serial killers?
Mm-hmm. How?
Say that again?
Like, how do we imagine that we could set a mandate for the police and tell them they could just investigate serial killers and they'd obey us?
Yeah. How? That's why I said a necessary evil, setting yourself up for failure in the first place. There's no way it's tenable.
Police haven't lost any funding. They've got far more funding since so-called defunding And they're all over the news talking about how they're not getting enough money, they don't get enough respect. In Vancouver, they endorsed a candidate in the city council elections because they're like, basically all this safe supply stuff is going too far and this defund stuff. In my city, where our conservative chief is extremely conservative. This is not a progressive chief. He got a no confidence vote. That's the ranks just being like, fuck you. You're not going to tell us what to do. Like, so what makes us imagine that if we went and said, okay, guys, just serial killers now. We think these people that have guns and tanks and okay, black people, sounds good. Like, you know, like, how is this going to happen?
When every 2 years a new study shows that if the police have been basically infiltrated by right-wing neo-Nazis and stuff, like, they're not going to listen to us. I will just say that.
So when we say actually, well, wait, 1 second. So Elle, you have to go soon, right?
Yeah.
And same for me.
Okay. So when you do have to go, do sign off. But then I have to ask this, Berneta, before you go on and explain what you're going to say. So when people throw, well, what are we going to do when the terrorist attack does happen? What are we going to do when an extremist does target queer people? What we call hate crimes. Is the goal then? Okay, yes, that's going to happen, but we need to, but in order to stop that, we have to eradicate heteronormativity, patriarchy, institutional racism, white supremacy. Let's really call it what it is, because we can't be institutionally racist because we don't have power. But white supremacy, right? Or
again, I mean, the police commit hate crimes. Like, as Berneta said, there's like massive like white supremacist like wings within the police and like the military. It's the same thing we've already said. Like, there was a serial killer in Toronto that was killing gay men, and people reported to the police, and the police didn't do anything. Like this
same thing happened in Australia, by the way, who are also as grotesquely racist to the core as the FBI and the RCMP.
The Net shot up a mosque in Quebec, and he had a year of making violent comments online, and they didn't bother intervening because they're too busy tracking Black Lives Matter activists and environmental activists and Indigenous people. So, like, this is what they do. So, since when did the police solve hate crimes? Good luck. You go to the police and you're like, I'm experiencing someone stalking me. And they're like, oh, well, if they didn't actually post your address online with a death threat, it's fine. Like, they don't do anything. The police don't solve hate crimes. They are a hate crime.
Yeah. I think really this whole conversation has been about how do you weigh abolition with the need to address public safety threats, like serious public safety threats. And I would conclude by saying that the criminal justice system is always saying that there's one strategy for everything: make arrests, put people in prison, right? What abolitionists are simply saying is, well, let's just figure out a way of doing this, another way of doing this, and try to develop some sort of concrete prevention strategies. Not all homicides are the same. Is it a domestic violence case? Is it a school shooting? Is it a drug deal gone bad? Like, we know that in a lot of school shooting cases, somebody had a pretty good idea that it might happen, but didn't tell anyone. Or they told police and the police had no tools to do anything about it. So what if instead we had some different kind of system where a young person thinks their friend might do something awful? They can go talk to a responsible adult without worrying about police getting involved, without worrying about having ratted out their friend to the police, or getting their friend expelled from school because of some zero tolerance policy. It's very, very important to parrot what neoliberals and liberal friends of mine like to say. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's no perfect solution, right? There's no perfect world.
Before we end, we respond. Ms. Jones, I'm going to give you a heads. I'm going to let you go. So we were joined by L. Jones, poet, racial, social justice activist, and journalist of the Breach and Halifax Examiner. She's also an anti-imperialist, and she is a professor of political and Canadian studies at Mount St. Vincent University. She's about to do the Black Power Hours. So, Ms. Jones, you're free to go, and I'll wrap up the conversation.
I'm always vibing with Berneta. I'm like,
yeah.
And this will be the first of many. This will be the first of many. So you're free to go, and
but I do have to get going and look up news. Okay, bye guys.
Ciao. And she's also the author of Abolitionist Intimacies, which people should get. And but then so Bernita, three things before I let you go. Then, because wow, so much to ponder and so much to ponder and so much to think about. But it's very interesting, and I'm really glad that I do have these conversations and that I do 1+1 for that because. No, I think it's because I think when somebody brings up the idea of the Islamic extremist or the white supremacist that does shoot a bunch of black people in the church and so forth. I guess if I was an abolitionist, and I wouldn't call myself an abolitionist, but I am for community control over the police. But I'm sure my interpretation of it is completely different from other people who advocate that. But in order to stop racist terrors from the odd KKK person, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. We have to actually eradicate white supremacy as an institution, which comes in different forms. It comes in the form of, yes, this is apartheid South Africa, but also, but when people say that the United States is a democracy, or Australia, New Zealand, France, or America are democracies, I would say, okay, maybe in name, maybe on paper, but in reality, these are all classist systems, and these are all settler colonial systems. Right. It doesn't. We don't explicitly say like Native Americans are the Dalits, and we're going to continue persecuting them. But that is the system, and we have to challenge that and just completely eradicate that system. And the racist gangs are just a byproduct of that institutional racism, in which the police were founded to be the racist thugs and state terrorists that they are. Is that how you would push back against people who bring up, well, what would we do about hate crimes and stuff like that?
I would definitely push back in a similar way. We've just had evidence of how giving police more power to handle hate crimes ends up turning on leftists, ends up turning on those who are trying to hold the police accountable. Here in Atlanta, the protesters trying to save the forest from becoming Cop City, the Black community members trying to prevent a Cop City from being built in their neighborhood. Many of them are being charged under the same anti-terrorism law that was created after Dylann Roof shot up a church of Black folks in South Carolina, right? So it is very important to recognize that police are not here to really help us. They're not here to actually protect us. Literally, the Supreme Court has said they don't have any duty to serve and protect, to rescue or anything like that. So we have different ways of potentially visualizing a world without them, a world where we actually can care for each other better, more effectively, more humanely as community members, and as a society. Police like to say that they are the only thing standing between us and basically Arkham City, right? But that is simply not true. As I've said before, they handle according to the New York Times study, about 4% of what they do are violent crimes. Like a lot of it is just minor stuff, misdemeanors, things that people shouldn't even be in jail for or arrested for or pulled over for or whatnot. So I would always push back on the idea of giving police more power just because we need them to handle terrorism and white supremacist violence and things like that. Because all it does is turn on those it's meant to protect ultimately.
And I think sort of, a second to last thing before we end is I don't know. I think we need to get to a place, but that's going to require lots of uncomfortable conversations that even our communities need to have within ourselves. What was it that Elle often jokingly says this, but she's serious when she mentions this. She says that we don't even deal with the rapists in our circles, and abolitionism was started by people who were abused within their own family. Yeah. So, ergo, it seems as if we need to start having, however uncomfortable it is, and it's going to make many people cry, but we need to actually start to talk about the abuse that we that we do to one another, because you brought up about because you brought up about the whole pandemic of schools of school shootings, and for a long period of time there was office place massacres, and for that, and again, you have to have an anti-capitalist solution to that. That all goes back into the whole about the fact that like schools are basically, people talk about prisons, the what is it, the prison to pipeline, or the school
the school to prison pipeline.
Okay, much of the school shootings that take place are often because the people who shoot the schools up are often the reason is because like they were viciously bullied, and society says that if you do not graduate and if you don't go into the Harvards of the world and so forth, you're a loser for life. And that's where a lot of the Columbine high school shootings take place, as well as office plays massacres. And for that, people need to read Mark Ames' books, Going Postal. But then it sounds to me as if we have to really get past this whole idea of when somebody does do a grotesque crime, the answer isn't more violence, racking and stacking them in prison, having them being raped in prison, having them in solitary confinement. And even when they have paid their dues, we say, well, you're not allowed to vote, you can't have welfare, can't even stay with your family. So much for second chances. So is abolitionism
and
also...
you leave prison with debt. And you leave prison with debt in the United States. So, I mean, there's so many issues we didn't even touch upon that just further illustrate how the prison system it doesn't serve anything other than capitalist interests and those who have a hard-on for punishment. And the police feed that system. I mean, it just doesn't do what I think many people feel that prison should do, which is protect our society, protect us, and also potentially rehabilitate the individual. Doesn't do any of that.
Then one final thing, but then one final thing is in order to get to this point where, because it seems to me as if Black people are as if the Black community, Indigenous community, and Latinx community are willing to forgive people who have been involved in gang violence and drug trafficking and stuff like that, who do a lot of horrific crimes. Why? So it seems as if we can get to that point where we forgive people, we don't want to see mass incarceration because of all of the collateral damage that involves, and on top of the fact that like the drug war was founded to be the racist, anti-left war that it is. So if abolitionism is a process, is that so in other words, we have to also get to the point where when it comes to those who have committed sexual abuse and so forth, the answer isn't more violence and so forth, but it's that person has to acknowledge that they did that they did the crime. They listen, have to look into the eye of the person who's saying you did this, and then you ask for forgiveness. But it's up to them, the person themselves, and they want that forgiveness, or if that's all they needed just to face the person like that. And then,
I don't even think it's a matter of them asking for forgiveness either. I would not say that should be any sort of part of the restorative justice process. Now, if that victimizer does want to ask for forgiveness, that's up to them, but I don't think that should be part of the restorative justice process at all, because ultimately the restorative justice process is about centering the needs of the victim. And yes, for sure, helping the victimizer see the error of their behavior, and making the community whole again. And so there's this whole balancing act that has to happen between individual and collective, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to restorative justice, centering the needs of the victim, but also balancing that against the needs of the community. And hopefully throughout the whole process, the victimizer being able to see what they did to this person and like actually sit with it. Because if a person is able to look in the eyes of someone that they've done such harm to, the amount of time it's going to take for them to just sit with it and actually like accept and recognize what they've done, it's not a short period of time. So if you're automatically hopping to the forgiveness question, you're not processing what you've done anyway.
But sadly, it seems, sorry to my leftist friends if I was sort of mocking, Karl Marx, Mao's Little Red Book. But it sounds to me as if we want so badly everything to be in like a manifesto, or everything like it needs to like society needs to be like this, society needs to be like that. This is what we do when this happens. This is what we need to do when that happens. Is that why the abolitionist movement, the prison abolitionist movement, the police abolitionist movement has had such a hard time advancing itself?
I think it's had such a hard time because it's coming up against the very foundation of our culture, which is capitalism, number one, and it's very Protestant punishment-centered culture. I don't think it's the lack of a book or outline. Yeah, I don't think it's the lack of a book or outline. I think it's getting to the very foundation of what the U.S. and what a lot of the West is.
Interesting. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1. I'll read out both of the names. We were joined on this edition of 1+1 to be continued. And the next time we have this conversation, hopefully we can talk about Changeling, The Good Nurse, and Rogue Agent, because I really would love to talk about those films, all based on true stories. But we're gonna have to save that for another time. But we're joined on this edition of 1+1. Our Black History Month special, All Things Canada special, and our Make Me Want to Holler All Things Black People special with my dearly beloved friend Berneta L. Haynes, a consumer protection attorney, independent sci-fi fantasy fiction writer, outspoken leftist on Twitter, and an abolitionist, NL Jones poet, racial social justice activist, journalist with The Breach and Halifax Examiner, co-host of the Black Power Hour on CKDU FM, where she's doing her program right now, and of course, University Professor of Political and Canadian Studies, Mount St. Vincent University in Nova Scotia, Canada. Berneta, it was an honor again to talk with you. There's another thing I wanted to ask you, but I'm going to ask you off the air, but thank you so much for coming back on the program. A long time coming, and
yes, indeed.
And again, always brilliant conversations, and looking forward to the next one.
Well, thank you for having me. I'll look forward to the next one too.